I want to talk about equality and inequality. Now, first of all, there's nothing intrinsically beautiful or desirable about equality. I mean, it really is a creed of inferiority. It's a lowest common denominator kind of ideal. You know, equality really only appeals to the worst, to the below average, or even to the way below average. So all of those criticisms, those conservative and libertarian criticisms, are valid. And you do want excellence to be able to distinguish itself. You do want ability to rise to the top. Because you want to be able to capture the benefits that it creates for your whole society. And so that kind of libertarian conservative critique of egalitarianism is perfectly valid, as far as it goes. But like a lot of things, it can only really go so far. And there is an extent to which egalitarian sentiments are potentially valid or at least potentially worth indulging somewhat. But you can take that too far also. And the reason is because people don't gauge their status in absolute terms. They gauge it in relative terms. And so they're always comparing themselves to one another. And this is why people don't buy the libertarian argument, that some of these people are always making, that, 100 years ago, the richest, most powerful men in the world couldn't afford an iPhone. Aren't you lucky to be able to afford an iPhone? Well, that's great. But if everybody has an iPhone, it's not a distinguishing status signal, or a distinguishing achievement, or a distinguishing accomplishment. And so whatever, absolute value it may have, it doesn't confer much in the way of relative value. It's a mass market product. Everybody can have one. So it's not, it's not an argument that normal people are going to buy. Yeah, it may be wondrous in a certain sense that you can afford an iPhone, but that doesn't make you higher status than the wealthy, powerful man of a century ago who couldn't, right? Because you're not competing with that man. You're competing with the men of today. And there's always, someone who can afford something that you can't. And, other people notice this too. And in particular, women notice this. So relative status is what gets you laid if you're a man. And so that's why people view these things in relative terms, because relative terms have evolutionary significance. They're of evolutionary consequence. And so that's why people view that in those terms, and that's why they're going to continue to view these things in those terms. They're not going to stop. They're not going to start viewing it in absolute terms. They're going to keep viewing it in relative terms. And so anything you can do to raise your status, even relative to the next nearest competitor, or even to close the gap, with that next nearest competitor, is going to improve your chances, evolutionarily speaking. And so, that's what people are doing when they employ egalitarian rhetoric or egalitarian sentiments, is, they're trying to compete with their rivals. And it's an effective form of competition, or it can be. It's not one you want to give free rein, because if it goes too far, then it becomes dysgenic. It becomes more costly than it's worth. But, that raises the question, is there any extent to which maybe it's productive to indulge these sentiments or to indulge these tendencies? And the case where it would be productive is where, the cooperation of the inferior man is more valuable than conflict, which you may ultimately prevail in. And, there could be cases where that's the case. And so throwing them a bone in terms of, egalitarian sensibilities, catering to egalitarian sensibilities or rhetoric or sentiments, may be worthwhile to purchase their cooperation if it's worth more than a conflict which may be costly and close fought, but that you ultimately prevail in. So there's a marginal benefit there. There's a marginal benefit to cooperation. The marginal benefit to cooperation is greater. It may be worthwhile to suck it up and try and procure the cooperation by catering to some egalitarian sentiments. And there's nothing noble about it. It's the opposite of nobility, because if you're nobility, then you're not tempted by egalitarian sentiments because you're elite, you're superior, and so there's nothing noble about egalitarian sentiments. You could say that noblesse oblige is kind of an egalitarian sentiment or sensibility or consideration, and that's the basically the calculated use of a certain amount of humility or duty to your inferiors in order to purchase their cooperation. If that cooperation is worth more than, let's say their submission or, a conflict, potentially even a fatal conflict in which you ultimately prevail, although you bear some costs and risks in order to do so. And so, noblesse oblige would be, maybe the noble expression of egalitarian sentiments. But it's not precisely egalitarianism, right? Because it's still coming from a position of privilege, a position of power. And it's not an admission or a pretense of equality necessarily. It's it maybe caters to that sensibility a little bit in some ways. So the egalitarian sentiments themselves are not particularly noble. They're the opposite of noble. But if there is some cooperation that can be purchased by catering a little bit to egalitarian sensibilities, it may be worthwhile up to a point. Obviously you don't want to take it too far, because you don't want to hobble the elite. You don't want to hobble the exceptional. You don't want to hobble the, or hamstring the, the virtuous or the capable or the productive or anything like that, to the extent that it becomes dysgenic. But to the extent that it enables cooperation, you may want to share some of the benefits that those exceptional individuals create with less exceptional individuals on, maybe more favorable terms than they might otherwise be able to obtain. So, that's something to consider. And, there's also some other ways you can attenuate egalitarian sentiments without necessarily catering to them. And one of those is to somewhat conceal the disparity in, wealth or productivity or capability. And there are a variety of ways of doing that. One of those ways is to spend less on consumption and more on savings and investment. So if you're accumulating wealth instead of consuming it conspicuously, then that decreases the apparent benefits of wealth. There are still benefits to accumulating wealth and amassing wealth and possessing wealth, power and security and everything else. But it decreases the apparent benefits to higher time preference people. They don't see the conspicuous consumption. They don't see the luxury as much. And you may want to do some conspicuous consumption as a form of signaling, just to remind people what's what. And there may be some value in that too, but there may also be some value in attenuating that somewhat to decrease the envy, to decrease the resentment, and to increase cooperation, while still preserving some, maybe less visible benefits of wealth and productivity. And another way of doing that would be to invest in reproduction and offspring. And so if you're wealthier and more productive, you have more offspring than the less wealthy and the less productive. And that does a couple of things. First of all, it tends to spread the benefits of wealth a little further, and so they're less apparent, they're less visible to the less wealthy, and so the resentment and the envy and therefore the egalitarian sentiments are less pronounced, and it's less necessary to cater to them in order to secure cooperation. But you're also filling the world with productive people, with more productive people over time, and so that will create more equality. Ultimately, if you're filling the world with more productive people, then there's less inequality because there's fewer relatively of the less productive kind. And so, there's fewer of the more troublesome kind. So you can preserve cooperation with them in the short term while outbreeding them in the long term and filling the world with more productive people who have less cause to be envious and resentful. And therefore, whose cooperation is less costly to purchase. Because they already are more equal by nature, by temperament, by birth. And so those are a couple of ways you can attenuate that. And, there are some productive trades you could negotiate. You could pay people not to reproduce. If people can't support themselves or they can't support offspring, pay them not to reproduce. And you'd probably want to state it diplomatically, but the basic form of the productive exchange being proposed there is, hey, we'll subsidize your standard of living if you don't burden the future with your unproductive genes. We'll subsidize your comfortable standard of living if you don't cause all the trouble that you could for our descendants by filling the world with yours. And that's worth something, and would tend to attenuate the apparent disparities in wealth and productivity in the short term, while actually attenuating them in the long term by eliminating the one source of inequality at the low end. And so there are other arrangements you could propose. You could pay the lower classes to defend the social order, the political order, the economic order, instead of disrupting it, and that's a valuable exchange, or a potentially valuable exchange, that allows them to share in the benefits by providing a productive service, even if they can't participate in production directly. Protecting the means of production and the, let's say the ground rules, the normative capital that production depends upon, that's a valuable service. And even just not disrupting it is a valuable service. And so if you say, hey, we need these rules in order to produce, we need secure property rights and other stuff, order, stability, peace, and we'll pay you to maintain all of that, or at least not to disrupt it, rather than to attempt to overthrow it, because nobody's going to support a system that doesn't seem to be working for them. But if a system works, then it should create enough benefits to pay, everybody worthwhile to participate in some capacity, or to defend it in some capacity. And you're never going to be able to pay everybody off. There's always going to be some people you need to coerce. And, the more people you can get on board to do that coercing rather than needing to be coerced, the better. And so you can recruit people over to your side with, pecuniary inducements. And that may be a lot cheaper than, crushing them. You may be able to build a bigger coalition for less than it would cost to build a smaller coalition to just overawe them. Because you don't need necessarily a big coalition in order to protect those rules, but that may not be the lowest cost way of obtaining that boon. It may be lower cost to pay them to participate in its production, in its protection, and or at least not its disruption, and also not to reproduce, or to reproduce at a lower rate. And so those are some some basic thoughts on equality and inequality, and there's more you could say about it, but that's a good start for now.